People use the phrase Middle Ages to describe Europe between the fall of Rome in 476 CE and the beginning of the Renaissance in the 14th century. Many scholars call the era the medieval period instead. Middle Ages, they say incorrectly, implies that the period is an insignificant blip sandwiched between two much more important epochs. The Middle Ages, birth of an idea. The phrase Middle Ages tells us more about the Renaissance that followed it than it does about the era itself. Starting around the 14th century, European thinkers, writers, and artists began to look back and celebrate the art and culture of ancient Greece and Rome. Accordingly, they dismissed the period after the fall of Rome as a Middle or even Dark Age, in which no scientific accomplishments had been made, no great art produced, no great leaders born. The people of the Middle Ages had squandered the advancements of their predecessors. This argument went and mired themselves instead in what 18th century English historian Edward Gibbon called barbarism and religion. This way of thinking about the era in the middle of the fall of Rome and the rise of the Renaissance prevailed until relatively recently. However, today's scholars note that the era was as complex and vibrant as any other. The Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. After the fall of Rome, no single state or government united the people who lived on the European continent. Instead, the Catholic Church became the most powerful institution of the medieval period. Kings, queens, and other leaders derived much of their power from their alliances with and protection of the Church. In 800 CE, for example, Pope Leo III named the Frankish king Charlemagne the Emperor of the Romans, the first since that empire's fall more than 300 years before. Over time, Charlemagne's realm became the Holy Roman Empire, one of several political entities in Europe whose interests tended to align with those of the Church. Ordinary people across Europe had to tithe 10% of their earnings each year to the Church. At the same time, the Church was mostly exempt from taxation. These policies helped it to amass a great deal of money and power. The Middle Ages, the rise of Islam. Meanwhile, the Islamic world was growing larger and more powerful. After the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 CE, Muslim armies conquered large parts of the Middle East, uniting them under the rule of a single caliph. At its height, the medieval Islamic world was more than 3 times bigger than all of Christendom. Under the caliphs, great cities such as Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus fostered a vibrant intellectual and cultural life. Poets, scientists, and philosophers wrote thousands of books. Scholars translated Greek, Iranian, and Indian texts into Arabic. Inventors devised technologies like the pinhole camera, soap, windmills, surgical instruments, and an early flying machine. And religious scholars and mystics translated, interpreted, and taught the Quran and other scriptural texts to people across the Middle East. The Crusades. Toward the end of the 11th century, the Catholic Church began to authorize military expeditions, or crusades, to expel Muslim infidels from the Holy Land. Crusaders, who wore red crosses on their coats to advertise their status, believed that their service would guarantee the remission of their sins and ensure that they could spend all eternity in heaven. They also received more worldly rewards, such as papal protection of their property and forgiveness of some kinds of loan payments. The Crusades began in 1095, when Pope Urban summoned a Christian army to fight its way to Jerusalem, and continued on and off until the end of the 15th century. In 1099, Christian armies captured Jerusalem from Muslim control, and groups of pilgrims from across Western Europe started visiting the Holy Land. Many of them, however, were robbed and killed as they crossed through Muslim-controlled territories during their journey. Around 1118, a French knight named Hugues de Payens created a military order along with 8 relatives and acquaintances that became the Knights Templar, and they won the eventual support of the Pope and a reputation for being fearsome fighters. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked the destruction of the last remaining Crusader refuge in the Holy Land, and Pope Clement V dissolved the Knights Templar in 1312. No one won the Crusades. In fact, many thousands of people from both sides lost their lives. They did make ordinary Catholics across Christendom feel like they had a common purpose, and they inspired waves of religious enthusiasm among people who might otherwise have felt alienated from the official church. They also exposed Crusaders to Islamic literature, science and technology exposure that would have a lasting effect on European intellectual life. The Middle Ages, art and architecture. Another way to show devotion to the church was to build grand cathedrals and other ecclesiastical structures such as monasteries. Cathedrals were the largest buildings in medieval Europe, and they could be found at the center of towns and cities across the continent. Between the 10th and 13th centuries, most European cathedrals were built in the Romanesque style. Romanesque cathedrals are solid and substantial. They have rounded masonry arches and barrel vaults supporting the roof, thick stone walls, and few windows. Around 1200, church builders began to embrace a new architectural style known as the Gothic. Gothic structures, such as the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis in France and the rebuilt Canterbury Cathedral in England, have huge stained glass windows, pointed vaults and pointed arches, and spires and flying buttresses. In contrast to heavy Romanesque buildings, Gothic architecture seems to be almost weightless. Medieval religious art took other forms as well. Frescoes and mosaics decorated church interiors, and artists painted devotional images of the Virgin Mary, Jesus, and the saints. Also, before the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, even books were works of art. Craftsmen in monasteries created illuminated manuscripts, handmade sacred, and secular books with colored illustrations, gold and silver lettering, and other adornments. Convents were one of the few places women could receive a higher education, and nuns wrote, translated, and illuminated manuscripts as well. In the 12th century, urban booksellers began to market smaller illuminated manuscripts like books of hours, psalters, and other prayer books to wealthy individuals. Chivalry and courtly love were celebrated in stories and songs spread by troubadours. Some of medieval literature's most famous stories include the Song of Roland and the Song of Hildebrand. The Black Death. Between 1347 and 1350, a mysterious disease known as the Black Death killed some 20 million people in Europe, 30% of the continent's population. It was especially deadly in cities, where it was impossible to prevent the transmission of the disease from one person to another. The plague started in Europe in October 1347, when 12 ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. Most sailors aboard the ships were dead, and those who were alive were covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. Symptoms of the Black Death included fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, terrible aches and pains, and then death. Victims could go to bed feeling healthy and be dead by morning. The plague killed cows, pigs, goats, chickens, and even sheep, leading to a wool shortage in Europe. Understandably terrified about the mysterious disease, some people of the Middle Ages believed the plague was a divine punishment for sin. To obtain forgiveness, some people became flagellants, traveling Europe to put on public displays of penance that could include whipping and beating one another. Others turned on their neighbors, purging people they believed to be heretics. Thousands of Jews were murdered between 1348 and 1349, while others fled to less populated areas of Eastern Europe. Today, scientists know the plague was caused by a bacillus called Yersinia pestis, which travels through the air and can also be contracted through the bite of an infected flea. The Middle Ages, economics and society. In medieval Europe, rural life was governed by a system scholars call feudalism. In a feudal society, the king granted large pieces of land called fiefs to noblemen and bishops. Landless peasants, known as serfs, did most of the work on the fiefs. They planted and harvested crops and gave most of the produce to the landowner. In exchange for their labor, they were allowed to live on the land. They were also promised protection in case of enemy invasion. During the 11th century, however, feudal life began to change. Agricultural innovations such as the heavy plow and three-field crop rotation made farming more efficient and productive. So fewer farm workers were needed, but thanks to the expanded and improved food supply, the population grew. As a result, more and more people were drawn to towns and cities. Meanwhile, the Crusades had expanded trade routes to the east and given Europeans a taste for imported goods such as wine, olive oil, and luxurious textiles. As the commercial economy developed, port cities in particular thrived. By 1300, there were some 15 cities in Europe with a population of more than 50,000. In these cities, a new era was born, the Renaissance. The Renaissance was a time of great intellectual and economic change, but it was not a complete rebirth. It had its roots in the world of the Middle Ages. What is your point of view in the Middle Ages? Share your thoughts in the comments section. If you enjoyed the video and learned something new, make sure to subscribe for more. Goodbye, everyone.